The Haptic session, and we've got two presentations, and I'd like to start straight away handing over to presenter number one. Let's begin.
Thank you so much. So, hello everyone. My name is Gonzalez. I'm from the Shape Lab at Stanford University, and today I'll be presenting work done with Professor Sean Follmer on investigating the detection of bimanual haptic retargeting in virtual reality. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of excitement about the promise of bringing our hands into virtual reality. By using our hands directly as opposed to handheld controllers, we can potentially create much richer, more immersive, and natural VR experiences. With existing tools like Leap Motion and other hand tracking solutions on the horizon, we're closer than ever to bringing our hands visually into the virtual world. However, as I'm sure many of us here might have seen, the first thing most users do when they see their hands in VR is reach out and try to touch something. While having a visually responsive environment helps, without physical feedback, there's a hard limit on how immersive that experience can be. So industry and researchers have been working towards bringing haptics to VR for years. Most commonly, this has been through developing active haptic devices, which use actuation to provide some force to the user's hand. Grounded devices such as the Phantom or Falcon can render precise forces, but typically only at single points within a limited workspace. Wearable devices, on the other hand, such as CyberGrasp and Wolverine, give users a wider workspace, but are limited in that they can't render externally grounded forces. So another approach has been to use passive haptics, which INSCO described as a technique where passive physical objects are used to physically simulate virtual objects. This approach is generally cheaper, more straightforward, and more realistic, since all the haptic feedback is obtained from interacting with the real object itself. So beyond its convenience, this approach has been shown to improve users' sense of presence, their cognitive mapping in virtual environments, as well as the realism of their interactions. So of course, one way of leveraging passive haptics is to physically recreate the infrastructure of the virtual world. This has been successful for some dedicated, immersive VR experiences, such as the Void, but in reality, it's clear that this approach is really way too inefficient, both in terms of cost and labor, to be practical. Ideally, we'd like to get the benefits of real-world passive haptic feedback without requiring a one-to-one match with the virtual world. So to do that requires making passive haptics more flexible, or in other words, making them reusable for different virtual objects across different experiences. Over the past few years, researchers have been exploring doing just that through the use of perceptual illusions to augment users' experiences with passive physical props. And in this work, we'll focus on haptic retargeting. So for those that might not be familiar, haptic retargeting is an interaction technique which leverages visual dominance to change the perceived location of a physical prop, allowing it to represent a virtual object in a different location. This technique works by incrementally offsetting the user's virtual hand from the real hand as they reach for an object. Due to visual dominance, the users naturally correct for this offset during the reach, resulting in the real hand being redirected to the prop as their virtual hand approaches the virtual object. And under certain thresholds, this entire process can take place undetected by the user, making retargeting both a promising and powerful technique for expanding the capabilities of passive haptics in VR. So retargeting lies under a larger umbrella of redirected haptic interaction in VR. Beginning with Coley's work on redirected touching, these works broadly aim to augment the perceived location, resolution, or shape of physical props in order to enhance the user's haptic experience in VR. And importantly, Zenner et al. Recently evaluated conservative detection thresholds of hand redirection. Understanding when and how this technique is perceptible to users is critical because it gives us a reference of how well it might work for our other desired applications. So while this research area has been very fruitful, the vast majority of the work has focused on single-hand interactions. However, bimanual interactions make up a core part of how we interact with the world. We use both our hands to manipulate objects, perform complex multi-step tasks, and take coordinated actions. It's therefore important that redirected bimanual interactions be explored in a similar way so that we understand the extent to which two-handed interactions might be made more flexible and effective through haptic retargeting in VR. Recently, Matthews et al. Did present the first investigation of bimanual haptic retargeting, though in the context of one hand holding an interface while the other makes a selection on that interface. This context of handheld interfaces, however, is rather limited. Redirection offsets were only about 1 centimeter or less, and most importantly, only one hand was visible during the study. So we wondered, how would the additional visual reference of the second hand influence users' perception of manipulation? Furthermore, what about the more general case of bimanual reaching, where a person is simply reaching for two objects with both hands? So these are the questions we set out to answer in our study. In particular, we ask, how do the amounts of left and right hand redirection influence the overall detection of retargeting during bimanual reach? And we also asked, how do the detection thresholds found during bimanual retargeting compare to those of single hand retargeting? So to answer these questions, we designed a study where users simultaneously reach with both hands to two spheres in virtual reality. Each hand was independently redirected during the reach so that the user touched a physical sphere when the virtual hand made contact. After completing each reach, users would report whether or not they perceived any offset between the real and virtual hands. So we recruited 14 participants for this within-subjects experiment and followed the method of constant stimuli, where different combinations of left and right hand retargeting were presented in random order. Haptic feedback was provided by two 3D printed spheres, which remained fixed throughout the study. Participants, however, were not shown the prop and did not know that it was fixed. They were simply told that they would feel a physical sphere when they touched a virtual sphere, and that there may be times when their positions did not match. They did, however, complete an initial training where they experienced a large amount of retargeting on either hand, so they would know what to be looking for during the study. So for this study, we limited retargeting to the vertical plane. Each virtual sphere was offset from its physical proxy rotationally about the user's shoulder. We chose to parameterize offsets in this way in order to account for participants with different arm lengths. We tested 8 offsets per hand, ranging from -24 to +24 degrees in increments of 6 degrees. And these values were selected from pilot testing of single-hand retargeting to provide a range of detectability. So this led to a total of 64 bimanual retargeting combinations. In addition, we also evaluated detection during single-hand reaches of the left and right hands at the same 8 offset levels. This brought the total number of experimental conditions to 80. And with 3 repeated trials per condition, each user took part in 240 total reaches. During the study, participants wore an Oculus Rift, noise-canceling headphones, and retroreflective markers on both index fingers. We used an OptiTrack system to stream motion capture data into Unity where the study was run. And participants sat in a height-adjustable chair at arm's length from the spheres. Their chair height was then adjusted such that their arms were 15 degrees below horizontal, which was selected for comfort based on pilot testing. Furthermore, participants began each reach from a starting point 50 centimeters from the respective physical spheres. So here we see a user performing a reach with each hand offset by 12 degrees in opposite directions. The physical hands and proxy are shown here in green for demonstration, but during the study, these were not visible. As the user reaches for the red and blue spheres, each hand is gradually offset such that it makes contact with the physical proxy. Here's another example where both hands are offset by +6 degrees. Again, we see that the virtual hands are gradually offset from the physical hands during the reach. Finally, here's an example where the left hand is offset by 6 degrees and the right hand is offset by 18 degrees. In all conditions, the hands are redirected to touch the physical props, and these props remained at a constant physical height throughout the study. So we'll first present results on detection in the bimanual retargeting conditions. To visualize our findings, we'll use this grid representation where rows correspond to the left-hand offset and columns correspond to the right-hand offset. To illustrate the types of bimanual retargeting captured by these different combinations, this grid can be divided into quadrants based on whether each hand is being offset upwards or downwards. In the upper right and lower left quadrants shown here, both virtual hands are offset from the physical spheres in the same direction. In the upper left and lower right quadrants, the hands are offset in opposite directions. So we'll first look at the overall detection rates in the case where the left and right hands were offset in opposite directions. So for each pair of offsets tested, the overall detection rate represents what proportion of all trials were detected by participants. A 0 indicates that the condition was never detected, and a 1 indicates that the condition was detected in every trial by all participants. For example, if we look at the extreme condition where the right hand was offset upwards by 24 degrees and the left downwards by 24 degrees, we'll see that our results show a detection rate of 0.88. So for 88% of the trials, this condition was reported detected. Looking back at the entire quadrant, the trend we see is pretty intuitive. As the magnitude of either hand's offset increases, the rate of detection tends to increase towards 1. We see a similar trend in the lower right quadrant, which again captures the condition where hands are offset in opposite directions, but this time the directionality is just flipped. Again, we see a pretty steep increase in detection as the offsets on each hand become larger. Shifting focus now to the cases where virtual hands were offset in the same direction, we see the same intuitive trend that increasing offsets on either hand tends to increase detection. Though in this case, the detection rates are reasonably lower, which are visualized by the lighter shades of blue along the diagonal here. So when we step back and look at these results as a whole, we see that the lower detection rates, which are about 0.5 and below, tend to be clustered around the diagonal of the matrix shown here. Likewise, the highest rates of detection tend to be clustered around the poles of the other diagonal. So to understand these trends, we need to consider the potential sources of discrepancy that influence whether the user may detect bimanual haptic retargeting. Of course, there's the absolute offsets of their visual hands from their physical positions. These capture how off the hands are globally in 3D space. But additionally, there's also potential discrepancy in the relative configuration of the hands. By this we mean the relative positions of the virtual hands compared to the physical hands. Even if the absolute offsets are reduced, there still may be some difference in the configuration of the hands, which could provide some cues to the user and influence detection. And this is in fact what we see when we look again at our trends in the data. So along the diagonal of lower detection rates, we see that these conditions tend to represent configurations where the virtual hands are level or nearly level with one another, matching the configuration of the real hands, which again, were always touching spheres at the same height. We hypothesize that this minimal difference in configuration contributes to the lower detection rates in this region. Similarly, in the case of higher detection rates, users' hands tend to be offset by large amounts in different directions, leading to relative configurations of the virtual hands that differ significantly from the physical counterparts. So going back to our first research question, beyond showing that increasing offsets on either hand leads to more detectable retargeting, our exploratory results showed that suggest that bimanual retargeting which preserves the relative configuration of the hands is less detectable than that which significantly changes the relative configuration of the hands. To further analyze the effects of left and right hand offsets on detection, we also fit a mixed effects logistic regression model to the data with left and right hand offset as main effects and participant as a random effect. Wald tests revealed significant interaction effects, which confirms that the level of redirection on one hand impacts the effect to which redirecting the other influences detection. So we were also interested in comparing bimanual haptic retargeting to single-hand retargeting in a meaningful way. In particular, we wanted to know how detection thresholds between the two cases compare. So these are the detection rates for single-hand retargeting conditions of the right hand alone. We omit the left-hand results here for clarity, but overall they are very similar. Traditionally, the most common way of analyzing the detection of haptic retargeting is to estimate a detection threshold by fitting a psychometric function to the data, shown here as a sigmoid function with model parameters A and B. The point at which the fit crosses 0.5 is considered the detection threshold. So we first plot the measured detection rates against their corresponding offsets. In this case, since we tested both upward offsets and downward offsets of the right hand, we fit two separate psychometric curves and obtain detection thresholds for each. For upwards offsets on the right hand, we found a threshold of 17.1 degrees, and for downward offsets, we found a threshold of 16.4 degrees. For bimanual retargeting, though, there is no single general threshold since there are two independent factors influencing detection. One way of obtaining a relevant threshold, however, is to reduce the data down to a single dimension and observe how modifying that dimension influences detection. We find thresholds for two illustrative cases of bimanual haptic retargeting. The first is the case where both hands are offset equally in the same direction. These correspond to conditions in the diagonal shown here. Since both hands have the same offset, a single value can be used to represent the amount of bimanual retargeting, and thus a single threshold can be found. The second case is where both hands are offset equally in opposite directions. This time, since the left hand's offset is simply the negative of the right, again we can represent bimanual retargeting using a single value and obtain a corresponding threshold. So for comparison, again, here is the psychometric fits and detection thresholds we found for single hand retargeting of the right hand. In the case of bimanual retargeting equally in the same direction, we found a threshold of 21.4 degrees for upwards offsets and negative 19.5 degrees for downwards offsets. For bimanual retargeting in opposing directions, we found thresholds of 14.3 degrees and negative 12.3 degrees. Note, in this case, we parameterize retargeting by the right hand offset so that we can compare with the other cases, but we emphasize that in this case, there's an angular offset between the virtual hands equal to 2 times the offset shown. So comparing to single hand retargeting thresholds, we see that the estimated thresholds for same direction bimanual retargeting are slightly larger. This suggests that adding a second hand during retargeting may actually strengthen the illusion and make it slightly harder to detect, in cases where the virtual hand configuration matches the real hand. We note, though, that there is some overlap in the confidence bounds of either threshold, so further study with more data is needed to better confirm this trend. Conversely, estimating were lower than for the single hand case, suggesting that this case is easier to detect. And when comparing this case to the same direction, the lower detection thresholds further support that our hypothesis that bimanual conditions, which significantly change the relative hand configuration, is more noticeable to users. So going back to our second research question, our results suggest that the directionality of bimanual retargeting can influence detection thresholds when compared to single hand retargeting. Specifically, offsetting both hands equally in the same direction appeared to slightly inflate thresholds, while offsetting hands in the opposite directions slightly reduce thresholds. So, in summary, we presented an initial investigation into the detection of bimanual haptic retargeting and found that bimanual retargeting during simultaneous reach can be effective. Our results suggest that in addition to the absolute offsets of either hand, the relative configuration of the virtual hands appears to play an important role in how noticeable the retargeting is to users. This was supported by a comparison with single hand retargeting, which suggested that redirecting both hands equally in the same direction may yield higher thresholds, while opposite direction retargeting may yield lower thresholds. So it's also important to note that our study had some limitations. First, the detection of haptic retargeting likely varies with setup and is likely influenced by factors such as the position of the props, how exactly the users are reaching, as well as the type and quality of haptic feedback used. Additionally, because we tested so many conditions, we had a limited number of repeated trials per participant, and thus we pooled the data between participants for analysis. While this gives a reasonable sense for overall trends, it doesn't capture the individual differences between participants, which may be important. And lastly, we only explored bimanual retargeting in the vertical plane, offsetting target objects about the shoulder. There are potentially different effects if the hands are redirected in different dimensions, such as orthogonally. So exploring this multi-directional haptic retargeting, as well as its effect on things like perception and task performance, is one interesting direction for future work. It'll also be important to determine how effective bimanual retargeting is during different types of reaches. In this case, we tested simultaneous reach, but there may be different effects if the hands reach sequentially, for example. Lastly, when we're using two hands at once, our visual attention may only be focused on one of the hands at a time, potentially shifting back and forth between the two hands during interaction. To better understand how effective bimanual haptic retargeting may be in more practical, interactive contexts, it'll be important to study the effect of visual attention on the illusion. In summary, we believe our results are an important first step in understanding how users perceive retargeting applied to both hands at once. By continuing to explore this space of retargeted bimanual interactions, we hope to empower researchers and designers to leverage these techniques and create even more flexible, immersive physical experiences in VR. And with that, thanks so much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions? We've got about 10 minutes. I think switch it on. Okay, so. Okay, well, I'll start off with a general question. I'm particularly interested in developing VR applications for industry. So, a general question, what kind of advice would you give a VR developer who intends to develop something for a company that requires some haptic feedback or haptic targeting in the application that they're developing? What advice would you give a VR developer based on your research? It's a general question.
Yeah, so in general, I think, so I can draw on some of like the related work that I've seen. So people might expect that if you're trying to use, for example, some real world object to provide haptic feedback, you might think that it needs to, match perfectly because, what you feel needs to match exactly what you see. But in reality, there's actually a lot of liberty that your brain kind of does to your advantage, so that you can have a kind of more physical, simple prop, and your brain will kind of interpret that as still feeling pretty realistic. So I think that's something that would be has a lot of potential to be leveraged by companies that are trying to have physical interactions in VR, that they could potentially get by. With a combination of having simple physical props as well as techniques like this, that are very low overhead, that require only kind of basically knowing which object someone's going to interact with, and you can kind of like basically compensate for any kind of positional difference or other limitations like that. So I think that there's in that space, it's basically. My advice would be that people's brains will do a lot of the heavy lifting compared to needing to make something be exact in terms of haptics.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It's working.
Okay.
Mine's kind of a general question too, but I noticed the kind of variation between the left and right-handed, as in whether there's a statistically significant or not. I'm not sure, but I'm kind of interested in the impact of left and right-handedness on these kind of interactions. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we haven't explored that explicitly. So for this study, because we had our general sense is that that might that might be important. So for our study, we recruited specifically right-handed participants, so we won't be able to examine the effect of handedness. But I definitely think that's a really good point and something to consider if we're doing things like trying to figure out, how people perceive this is, how dominant the hand that's being redirected is for the person probably does make a difference. But I think to date it hasn't been explicitly explored by any studies.
Oh, okay. Does dominant hand have any effects on this illusion?
So going off what I mentioned before, we didn't explicitly test whether dominant-handedness was a factor here because we recruited specifically right-handed participants. And I don't know off the top of my head of any other retargeting studies that did look specifically at handedness. There may be, but I'm not sure right now.
So is there any possibility to emphasize this effect if we know which hand is dominant?
Yeah, so for example, if there, my guess is that there is probably some at least small effect of handedness on how effective the illusion is. So yeah, you could definitely, I imagine you could definitely use that to your advantage if you knew, for example, which hand someone's going to be interacting with a certain object. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was brilliantly comprehensive. Your study was only with static objects. Could you speculate how dynamic objects might affect your findings?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the thing with this kind of retargeting and how effective it is that we found is that it seems to be pretty dependent on where in space the illusion or redirection is happening. And so because with the dynamic object, you're then kind of like adding in this new dimension of physically moving, the physical aspect, I think it would definitely, it's a little bit hard for me to figure out like the parameters that would affect that. But I mean, my sense is that it would definitely matter, for example, if you're touching an object that's moving closer to you, generally the redirection, or I think my hypothesis would be that if you'd be able to have less wiggle room, for example, with redirection if you're kind of operating closer to you versus farther than you, just as a kind of very general example. So if you have some kind of dynamic object that's moving within these ranges, you would definitely probably see difference in kind of how perceptible, how noticeable it is to users in that way. But yeah, I think that's really, really interesting potential future work to look at.
Okay, I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much. Give us time to change to the second speaker. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you so much.